I remember the hallway clearly. The afternoon light hit the floor tiles at an angle that made everything too bright and too harsh. My brother Marcus stood directly in front of me, physically blocking the path to the living room. His voice was calm. Perfectly calm. That's what I remember most. How controlled and measured he sounded, as if he'd rehearsed this moment. "I think it's best if you don't come back here anymore," he said, each word deliberate and weighted with finality. The words didn't register at first. Not because I didn't hear them, I heard them clearly, but because they didn't make logical sense within the context of our relationship. I waited for him to clarify, to add context, to explain what transgression I'd committed that warranted this sentence. He didn't. He just stood there, watching me process his words like he'd asked me to pick up milk from the store. His expression remained neutral, almost detached. I could see relatives in the periphery of my vision. A cousin near the kitchen doorway, frozen mid-motion. My aunt on the couch, her hand stopping halfway to her coffee cup. My uncle pretended to read the newspaper. No one moved. No one said anything. No one intervened or objected or even asked for clarification. They just watched in collective silence, and that silence was louder and more damning than any objection could have possibly been. That's when the realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't spontaneous anger. This wasn't an emotional outburst driven by a recent conflict. This was planned, orchestrated, rehearsed. I could see it in the way he'd positioned himself, the way the family had arranged themselves, the way everyone seemed to know exactly what was happening and had accepted it in advance. My life had just changed in a hallway, and everyone had known it was coming except me. The first week was the quietest of my life. No calls, no text. No one reached out with explanations or apologies. The silence was total. I kept my phone in my pocket, checking it obsessively, waiting for someone to tell me this was a misunderstanding. Nothing came. I replayed conversations from the month before, searching for the moment I'd crossed an invisible line. There were small things. Conversations that seemed normal now felt weighted with hidden meaning. Comments I'd laughed off had an edge to them. Then I found it. The old group chat. I'd been removed months earlier. I scrolled through the screenshots, watching the evidence accumulate. The inside jokes I wasn't part of. The planned gatherings without me. All of it started long before the hallway statement. The exclusion wasn't recent. It was premeditated and timed with precision. My cousin called on a Tuesday. She sounded uncomfortable. Her voice had a guilty quality, like she was delivering news she didn't believe but felt obligated to share. "People are saying things about you," she started. "I didn't believe them, but I thought you should know." The descriptions were brutal, unstable, difficult, selfish, manipulative. The words circulated through the family like fact. People I'd helped were repeating these lies. I listened to her describe this stranger wearing my name. Every instinct said to defend myself. But I didn't. Instead, I thanked her. I saved every word in my memory. The lies would matter later. I would need to remember exactly how they were being told and by whom. Few weeks passed. I saw my brother once at a grocery store. We didn't acknowledge each other. That night, he sent a message to several family members. My cousin forwarded it to me. "Distance is mutual. We've both decided it's healthier for everyone to maintain boundaries." I read it 3 times. The phrasing was clean, reasonable. He'd controlled the narrative completely. To everyone else, this looked like an agreement between equals. But we'd never had that conversation. He'd rewritten the story completely. And now the family was telling themselves this revised version was truth. He wasn't the one who'd orchestrated my removal from the family. We'd both just decided together that distance was necessary. It was mutual. It was healthy. Everyone said so. He controlled what people believed about me. That understanding shook me. I was cleaning out my bedroom one afternoon, moving boxes and sorting through accumulated years of items, when I found it tucked underneath some storage containers. An old manila folder, worn at the edges, containing documents I'd completely forgotten about. Inside were financial records, legal forms, property transfers, inheritance documents, counts, names and dates written in handwriting I recognized immediately. I remembered now. My parents had asked me to organize these materials when I was younger, before everything had changed. They'd said I was detail-oriented, trustworthy, responsible. They'd entrusted me with documents they considered important enough to keep safe. I'd kept them safe for years. Protected them. Never lost a single page. I started reading through them methodically, noticing patterns and sequences. Property sale dated 5 years ago. A will modification from 4 years ago. Counts transferred. Each entry had a precise date and notation. Then I saw something that stopped my breath and made my hands shake. There were gaps. Recent gaps. Significant gaps. Documents that should have existed based on context clues, versions that should logically have been created at various points, were missing entirely. And based on what remained, what I could still see and verify, I could reconstruct a clear pattern. Someone had removed pages strategically and deliberately. Someone had edited the timeline to tell a specific story. My exclusion from the family wasn't random. It wasn't personal in the way I'd initially thought. It wasn't about hurt feelings or a conflict that had escalated. It was practical and calculated. I was being removed because I knew too much about something. I was a liability. I was a witness to something that needed to stay hidden. The holidays arrived. My brother posted photos on social media. Family gatherings that I wasn't invited to. Celebrations that proceeded without acknowledgement of my absence. Everyone smiled in the photos. Everything looked normal and happy and complete and whole without me present. I studied those photos like they were pieces of evidence in an investigation. I zoomed in on faces. I examined backgrounds. The smiles seemed different now. Practiced, held a beat too long, like they were being performed rather than felt. My aunt's eyes looked tired underneath her makeup, carrying a weight they hadn't carried before. My cousin was standing further away from my brother than she used to, creating physical distance that felt deliberate. Something underneath the surface was breaking, even if the surface presentation looked fine and normal to outsiders. I started keeping detailed notes about who had stopped contacting me completely and who hadn't, categorizing people based on their response to my absence. Small patterns emerged with startling clarity. The relatives who stood to benefit most from my parents' estate, the ones with financial interest in certain family decisions, they kept the most distance now, as if my absence had been necessary to their interests. The ones who didn't have direct financial stakes still tried to reach out, always in cautious, carefully worded ways, apologizing for not being in touch, sounding guilty. It wasn't about me at all. Not really. I was useful to some people under certain circumstances and dangerously inconvenient to others. My brother had simply made the inconvenience official by removing me from the equation entirely. By midwinter, the descriptions of me had solidified into something approaching consensus. I was unstable, difficult, the kind of person who pushed people away and burned bridges. I was broken in ways that made me fundamentally unreliable and unsafe to be close to. I heard these things secondhand, always through carefully worded conversations. No one would say them directly to my face. They'd all just repeat what they'd heard from someone else, adding their own concerned tone and sympathetic expression to make it sound like they were looking out for me, warning me for my own good. But I wasn't angry. Not in the way I'd expected to be. Instead, I started saving things systematically. Screenshots. Names of who said what and when. A cousin's awkward comment buried in a text conversation. My brother's mutual decision email. The group chat I'd been removed from months earlier. I created a detailed timeline in a notebook. I documented every lie with precision and accuracy. I cross-referenced dates. I noted inconsistencies. Because I was beginning to understand something fundamental. If I ever needed to defend myself or prove what had actually happened, these documents would matter more than my words ever could. These records would be proof. My brother sent me a message 3 months after the hallway statement that changed everything. It was brief and carefully worded, as if he'd spent time selecting exactly the right phrasing. Hope you're doing well. Haven't heard from you in a while. Would be good to reconnect sometime. It was the first time he'd initiated contact since rejecting me in front of the family. The tone was casual and warm, like nothing significant had happened between us. Like he hadn't orchestrated my removal from the family structure. Like he hadn't lied about my character to everyone we knew. I responded with 2 sentences. Polite. Oh. Honest but distant. I thanked him for reaching out and said I was doing fine. He didn't reply. I waited a week for a response that never came. Then 2 weeks. Then a month. He stopped trying. It was like he'd tested whether I'd come crawling back, desperately seeking his approval and acceptance, and when I didn't, when I maintained my calm distance, he'd lost interest in the pretense of civility. That told me something important about his psychology. He needed me to be broken by his rejection. He needed me to apologize or beg or show some sign of desperation. My calm refusal to do that, my steady indifference to his attempts at reconnection, was apparently worse than silence. I organized everything into a detailed spreadsheet on my computer. People. What was said? What was withheld? Who benefited from what decisions? The gaps in the timeline grew more obvious the more I stared at them and analyzed them. The money transfers happened in a specific sequence that seemed deliberate. The family gathering where I was excluded came right after a particular transfer. The mutual decision announcement came strategically timed, after enough damage had been done to my reputation that no one would trust my side of the story anyway. It wasn't chaos or raw emotion or impulse or passion. It was strategy. Cold, calculated strategy. My brother had a plan, and my exclusion was a necessary step in executing it. I wasn't rejected because of who I actually was or what I'd actually done. I was removed because I knew things, kept records, asked questions that required honest answers. I was a witness he needed gone, a person who couldn't be controlled or manipulated. I started asking casual questions to various family members. Not aggressive questions. Not confrontational. Just casual, innocent-sounding questions about timelines and family events and financial matters. I'd reach out to cousins I hadn't spoken to in months and ask them about basic facts. Their stories didn't match each other. Not even close. One cousin said the property had been sold in March. Another cousin said February. My brother had mentioned May in a conversation I'd overheard at the grocery store. 3 different people had 3 different stories about the same event. When I asked directly about specific dates, people got quiet, uncomfortable. Their responses became evasive. One cousin finally admitted, almost apologetically, under gentle questioning, that she'd been warned not to discuss certain things with me. He said you wouldn't understand the situation, she said quietly. He said it was complicated and that you might get upset or misinterpret things. He said I should just not talk about it with you for everyone's sake. My brother had actively warned the family against me. He'd poisoned every possible conversation I could have had about what was actually happening. He'd built walls between me and information. That's when I knew. This wasn't just rejection. This was deliberate isolation, systematic and calculated. I sat with all of this documentation for weeks and asked myself a hard question that I needed to answer honestly. Was I becoming someone I didn't want to be? I was keeping detailed records of every lie, every inconsistency, every strategic move my brother had made. I was building a case against him like he was a defendant in a trial I was running privately in my head. I was compiling evidence. I was strategizing. Part of me wanted to walk away completely. Burn the folder. Delete the spreadsheet. Decide that my family wasn't worth the mental and emotional energy it was taking and move forward with my life completely untethered from this mess. But I couldn't quite do it. I couldn't make myself walk away. Because another part of me knew that walking away meant accepting the lie as truth. It meant letting his version of reality be the truth everyone believed about me. It meant becoming the unstable, difficult, unreliable person he'd told them I was. I wasn't ready to give him that victory. I wasn't ready to let him rewrite my character permanently. I just didn't know yet what I'd do with what I knew. I didn't have a plan. I just had the truth and the documentation. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday when my phone rang. The number displayed was my brother's. I almost didn't answer the call, almost let it go to voicemail. When I did answer, his voice was different than I'd ever heard it before. Not calm, not controlled. There was something strained underneath his words, a tightness that suggested he'd been holding his breath for hours before making this call. "Hey," he said. And then he said my name, carefully, like it was a name he'd almost forgotten how to pronounce. Like speaking it felt unfamiliar. I waited. I didn't greet him back. I didn't offer him any comfort or familiarity. I just waited in silence for him to continue. "I need to ask you something," he said finally. "And I know you probably don't want to talk to me anymore, and I wouldn't blame you if you hung up right now, but I need your help. I really need your help." There was real desperation in his voice. Not performative. Not calculated. Real genuine desperation. My stomach twisted with the realization of what this meant. Because I suddenly understood that whatever he'd been building toward, whatever the exclusion had been for, whatever the plan had been, something had gone critically wrong. He explained it carefully over the phone, using the kind of language someone uses when they're trying very hard to convince you that their request is reasonable and fair. He needed information. Specific information about financial records from several years ago. Information that I had. Information that only I possessed. Information that he couldn't access any other way. "Mom and Dad asked me to handle some things," he said. "Some financial matters that need to be organized and updated. And I need to verify some dates. Timelines. I know you kept copies of everything when you were helping them organize their documents." I listened to him explain a situation that sounded innocent on the surface. Handling family finances, managing estate issues, the kind of thing an older sibling might reasonably do and need help with. But I'd spent months documenting his patterns, his word choices, his lies. I knew how he spoke when he was lying. I knew the careful distance he put between himself and the truth. I knew his tells. And I heard them all in this conversation. "I'll think about it," I told him calmly. I hung up before he could push further or try to manipulate me into agreeing immediately. That night I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about one question that terrified me because I thought I knew the answer. What had broken in his plan that he suddenly needed the person he'd thrown out? I didn't call him back. I just showed up at my parents' house without announcing it beforehand. It was a Saturday morning. I knocked on the door like I was a stranger, like I hadn't grown up in this house, like I didn't have keys and a right to enter. My mother answered, and her face went through 3 different emotions simultaneously. Surprise, guilt, confusion, recognition, concern. "Hi," I said simply. "I'm here to talk about the documents Ethan mentioned." She let me in. My brother was in the living room. Conversations stopped abruptly the moment I appeared. My aunt was there. My cousin. A lawyer I'd never seen before. Someone in a suit with a briefcase. They were all staring at papers spread across the coffee table. Important papers. Financial documents. Some of them looked familiar to me because I'd handled them before. "What's going on?" I asked, even though I was beginning to understand. My brother stood up slowly. He looked tired in a way I'd never seen before, like he hadn't slept properly in days. "We have a problem," he said finally, his voice defeated. "And we need your help to fix it." On the table, I could see documents with redacted sections. Missing pages. Incomplete records that didn't make logical sense. They tried to proceed without me and hit a wall they couldn't overcome. I walked to the table slowly and deliberately and looked at what they had assembled. It was immediately obvious what was missing. The earlier versions. The originals. The unedited documents that showed the actual timeline of decisions and transfers and authorizations. My brother had tried to reconstruct everything from what remained, but he'd hit gaps, inconsistencies, parts of the story that didn't fit together without the pieces he'd removed and hidden. And I had those pieces, every single one. I'd kept them exactly as they were, dated, preserved, untouched by time or manipulation. "I have what you need," I said quietly. My brother looked at me, and I saw something break in his face. Relief mixed with something else. Something like shame finally after all this time. Thank you, he started to say. I didn't say I'd give it to you, I interrupted. The room went completely silent. I asked a simple question. I asked about a property transfer from 4 years ago. When exactly it had happened. Who had authorized it. What the terms were. My brother answered confidently, speaking like someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. He gave me dates, names, details. He sounded certain and authoritative. Then my aunt asked him a follow-up question. She was quiet about it, almost apologetic, but it was a question that assumed a completely different date than the one he just confidently provided. The lawyer pulled out a document from his briefcase. Actually, this shows the transfer was completed in March, not May. My brother's face shifted. He corrected himself quickly, but the correction didn't make logical sense with what he'd said seconds before. The timeline he was constructing was falling apart. I watched him try to recover, watched him construct a new explanation that attempted to cover the gap, to make the inconsistency seem reasonable and explainable. Didn't work. Couldn't work. Because I had the original document in my folder at home. The real document untouched. And the date on that document was unambiguously March. My brother had tried to shift it to May because something about May served his narrative better, served his plan better. But he couldn't explain why he'd gotten the date wrong without revealing that he'd known the real date all along. The lawyer asked more questions. More detailed questions. My brother grew defensive. Not angry, defensive. There's a crucial difference. Anger is explosive and reactive. Defensiveness is someone trying to protect a position they know is collapsing. This is getting into territory that's really not relevant to what we're trying to accomplish here, he said, his voice taking on an edge. We need to focus on solutions, not rehashing old decisions. But the lawyer was thorough. The lawyer kept asking, kept digging, kept requesting clarification. And that's when my brother looked directly at me and said something that revealed everything he'd been thinking. Your sister is manipulating this situation. She's trying to make me look bad. The room froze in shock. I hadn't said anything accusatory. I hadn't made a single accusation. I hadn't presented a piece of evidence. I just asked questions and let the documents speak for themselves. The fact that truth-seeking felt like manipulation to him told me he knew exactly what he'd done and how wrong it was. I went home that afternoon and returned the next day with my folder. The entire folder with every document I'd preserved. I didn't announce it dramatically. I didn't make a speech or a grand gesture. I just placed the folder down on the coffee table, pulled out the relevant documents, and arranged them chronologically with precision. Original dates. Untouched records. Every version of every document that proved what had actually happened, in the order it had happened. These are the real timelines, I said quietly. We looked at them together. Dates lined up differently than my brother had claimed they did. Decisions that he'd attributed to certain people turned out to have been made by different people entirely. The sequence of events he'd described was actually impossible based on what the documents showed. My aunt sat back in her chair. This doesn't match what you've been telling us. My brother had no response that made any sense. My cousin, the one who'd admitted she was warned not to talk to me, finally spoke up. She'd been quiet up until this moment, but now she found her voice. Actually, I remember this differently, she said, looking at the timeline. Ethan told me the property was sold to cover. He said it was to cover some debts. But that's not what these documents show at all. You weren't supposed to discuss this with her, my brother said sharply, his voice angry now. Why not? My cousin asked. She sounded genuinely confused, genuinely bothered by the implication that she shouldn't be discussing family matters with family. Why wouldn't I be allowed to tell her what actually happened? Why would that be a problem? That question hung in the air like a physical object. 'Cause there was no good answer. There was only the real answer. He needed her silence to maintain his narrative, to keep his version of events from being contradicted by reality. Everyone in the room looked at my brother at once. And he understood what that unified gaze meant. The power had shifted irrevocably. But my brother tried anyway. He actually laughed. It was genuine laughter, like this was all ridiculous, like we were making a mountain out of a molehill, like this didn't matter. "You're all overreacting," he said. "These documents are old. Financial situations are incredibly complicated. The point is we're here now, trying to figure it out." "By lying about timelines?" the lawyer asked flatly. "I'm not lying," my brother said. "I'm interpreting the situation based on what I remember. Memory isn't always precise. Your memory is contradicted by documentation," the lawyer said without emotion. "Documentation is more reliable than memory." My brother's arrogance was incredible to witness. He actually believed that if he just maintained his confidence, if he just insisted hard enough, if he just refused to admit wrongdoing, reality would bend to his version of events. It wouldn't. Couldn't. Then my aunt produced something. She'd brought her own copies of documents. Copies she'd kept privately for years. Copies that matched mine exactly. My brother's face drained of color completely. We spent the next 3 hours reconstructing the actual sequence of events. Methodically. With documentation at every single step. What emerged was clear and undeniable. My brother had attempted to alter the timeline of certain financial transfers to justify decisions that he'd made unilaterally. Decisions he didn't have authority to make. Decisions that significantly affected my parents' estate and my future inheritance. He hadn't consulted anyone. He'd acted alone. And when questions started coming up, when people wanted to understand the logic of what he'd done, he'd panicked. He'd realized his actions couldn't be explained or justified. He'd removed the original documents. He'd lied about dates. He'd isolated me so I couldn't answer questions about what I'd kept safe. The manipulation was sophisticated and calculating and deliberate. It was also completely undeniable once you looked at the evidence. When it was over, when the timeline had been reconstructed and all the inconsistencies had been addressed, my brother was quiet. Completely, utterly quiet. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what he'd tried to do and what he'd been caught doing. "I need your cooperation," he said finally. "To fix this. To correct the records. To explain what happened to our parents. To make this right." He was asking me. Not commanding. Not rejecting. Just asking. His voice stripped of all authority. I looked at him across the table. This person who'd told me not to come back, who'd poisoned my relationships with lies, who'd lied to everyone about who I was and why, who'd tried to isolate me. And I realized I had power now. Real power. Not the performative kind. The kind that came from holding the truth and having evidence. Everyone in the room waited for my answer. My parents, my aunt, my cousin, the lawyer. They all waited to see what I would do. I didn't threaten him. I didn't demand apologies or promises of better treatment. I didn't ask him to undo the social damage he'd done or make public statements recanting the lies he'd spread. Instead, I set conditions. Fair conditions. Legal conditions. Documented conditions that could be enforced. The records would be corrected. Officially. Completely. My role in keeping the documents safe would be acknowledged. The misrepresentations would be addressed with my parents directly and honestly. And in the future, I would be consulted on any family financial matters that affected me. Not as a courtesy. As a requirement. As a right. He had no leverage. We both understood that with absolute clarity. He could refuse. He could insist on his version of events. But then the truth would be addressed differently. Through lawyers. Through official channels. Through whatever mechanism was necessary to set the record straight permanently. He agreed to everything. The corrections happened over the next 2 weeks. Documents were amended officially. Records were updated. My parents were given the full timeline, the entire story without omission. They asked me to come over on a quiet evening. We sat together in the living room, and they apologized. Not just for believing my brother, but for not asking questions when I'd been excluded. For accepting his narrative without hearing my side. For failing to protect me. We failed you, my mother said, her voice breaking. I didn't argue with her. I didn't need to hear it repeated or explained further. I just needed them to understand the truth. My brother wasn't at that conversation. He avoided my eyes for months afterward. He seemed diminished, smaller, less certain. Eventually he apologized too. Not a real apology with genuine remorse. The kind of hollow statement that comes after you've been caught and have no other option but to try to salvage what's left. I accepted it because it wasn't for him. It was for me, to mark that something had changed. I didn't move back in. I didn't reclaim my old room or rebuild the daily relationships I'd had before. I didn't forgive him in the way people expect forgiveness to work. Clean and permanent and wholesome and healing. What I did was reclaim my name. My identity. My narrative. I stopped being the unstable, difficult sister that the family had been told I was. I stopped being invisible. I stopped accepting the narrative that other people had written about me to serve their own interests. I was the person who kept important records with integrity, who paid attention to details, who didn't panic when confronted with her own inconvenience, who could remain calm and rational even when being rejected and isolated and lied about. I was inconvenient to control. That was my real crime. But I was also strong enough to outlast the attempt, to maintain my integrity, to preserve the truth. My brother needed me in the end, not because I was weak or desperate or broken, but because I'd been paying attention the whole time. Because I'd protected what mattered. Because I refused to let someone else's lie become my reality. I left my parents' house that evening knowing something crucial and life-changing. I hadn't needed their validation or their apology or even their belief in me to be okay. I had needed to know the truth. And I'd protected it. That was enough. That was everything. I reclaimed my peace by refusing to let someone else's narrative become my reality. I reclaimed my power by maintaining my integrity when I could have destroyed him. And I never went back to asking for permission to be who I actually was.